There is a study conducted by researchers at Oregon State University, published in 2014 in the journal Sex Roles, that most of the people who have strong opinions about Barbie have never read, and that changes the conversation when they do. The study took girls between the ages of 4 and 7 and divided them into 3 groups. The first group played with Barbie dolls in careers, a Dr. Barbie, an Executive Barbie. The second group played with a more neutrally proportioned doll in a similarly neutral career. The third group played with a board game unrelated to dolls or careers. After a few minutes of play, the researchers asked each girl 2 questions. First, how many jobs are available to you when you grow up? Second, how many jobs are available to boys when you grow up? The girls who had played with Barbie reported, on average, that significantly fewer careers were open to them than to boys. The girls who had played with the neutral doll or the board game reported approximately equal availability. A few minutes of playing with a doll, that was enough to shift what a 4-year-old believed was possible for herself in the world. That study is one piece of evidence in a debate that has been running with varying degrees of sophistication and varying degrees of ideological investment. Since Barbie was introduced at the American International Toy Fair in New York City on March 9th, 1959, it is the debate that this documentary is going to examine. Not to resolve it, because the evidence does not permit a resolution that is satisfying in the way that simple answers are satisfying, but to examine it with the honesty and the specificity that the question deserves, and that most of the popular conversation about it has not provided. Because the Barbie debate is not really a debate about a plastic doll. It is a debate about aspiration and representation and the specific mechanics of how children form beliefs about themselves and what is available to them. It is a debate about what we give children when we give them something to play with and what we are really giving them, and whether the two things are the same. The people who have defended Barbie across the 65 years of her existence have made arguments of genuine substance. They have pointed to the careers, to the more than 200 professional roles that the Mattel doll has occupied across her history, including astronaut and surgeon and president and architect and computer engineer and Supreme Court justice. Many of them in decades when women in those roles in the actual world were rare to non-existent. They have pointed to the specific quality of possibility that the doll represented to generations of girls who received it as a message, you can be anything. They have pointed to the studies that show girls who played with Barbie demonstrating higher career aspirations in certain contexts, and to the testimonies of women across multiple generations who describe the doll as having given them in childhood a version of an adult female identity that was active and capable and present in the world in a way that the female figures in their immediate environment were not always able to model. The people who have criticized Barbie across those same 65 years have also made arguments of genuine substance. They have pointed to the body, to the measurements that have been calculated and recalculated by researchers in multiple countries, and that if translated to a living woman would produce a person of approximately 5 feet 9 inches with a neck too thin to support her head, a waist too narrow to contain the full complement of her organs, and feet permanently positioned in a high heel angle that would prevent normal standing. They have pointed to the studies showing correlations between early Barbie exposure and body dissatisfaction, disordered eating ideation, and the specific quality of appearance-based self-evaluation that the research on body image in girls and women identifies as among the most damaging contributors to lifelong psychological difficulty. They have pointed to the racial history to the decades in which Barbie was exclusively white, and the specific message that exclusivity sent to the girls who are not. Both sets of arguments are real. Both sets of evidence exist, and the honest examination of the question requires taking both seriously rather than dismissing either in the service of a predetermined conclusion. That is what this documentary is going to do. And by the time it is finished, the question that the title poses, did Barbie empower girls or damage them, is going to look considerably more complicated than either the defenders or the critics have been willing to acknowledge. Because the answer is both, and the both is not a compromise, it is the most interesting and the most honest assessment of what 65 years of a plastic doll have actually done to the girls who play with her. If the real story behind the things we give children, the things we tell them, are just toys, is a kind of story you come here for, subscribe. What we are about to examine is one of the most consequential debates in the history of childhood, and almost nobody is having it, honestly. Ruth Handler created Barbie. This is a sentence that the official history of Mattel and the official history of the doll repeat, and it is true in the way that origin stories that flatten complex processes into individual acts of creation are true, which is to say, it captures something real and omits something important. Ruth Handler was the co-founder of Mattel, along with her husband Elliot Handler and their business partner Harold Matson. She had, by the mid-1950s, been watching her daughter Barbara play with paper dolls and had observed something specific in the way Barbara played. She was not interested in playing with baby dolls, which was the dominant form of doll available to children in the American toy market of the 1950s. She was interested in projecting an adult identity. She was interested in imagining herself as grown up, as capable, as occupying adult roles. The paper dolls allowed her to do this. Ruth Handler's insight was that a three-dimensional version of the same projection opportunity, a doll that was adult, that wore adult clothes, that occupied adult roles, could be commercially viable in a way that the toy industry of the 1950s had not recognized. The toy industry of the 1950s had not recognized it because the toy industry of the 1950s was operating from a specific set of assumptions about what play was for and what dolls were for. Dolls were for practicing motherhood. Baby dolls, which required feeding and burping and dressing, and the miniaturized performance of the domestic caregiving roles that adult women in the 1950s were expected to inhabit, were the instrument through which girls were supposed to practice the life that was coming. Ruth Handler's insight that girls might want to play at being adult rather than at caring for babies was, in the specific cultural context of the 1950s, more radical than it sounds. It was a recognition that girls had aspirations that the available toys were not serving. The toy she built to serve those aspirations would, across the subsequent decades, become simultaneously the most successful toy in the history of the industry and the most contested object in the history of childhood. The Build Lily doll is the part of the origin story that Mattel's official history has managed most carefully and that the full record makes most necessary to include. Build Lily was a German doll based on a comic strip character published in the Hamburg newspaper Bild Zeitung from 1952 onwards. The Lily character in the strip was a blonde, shapely, sexually knowing young woman whose humor was organized around her relationships with men and whose appeal was explicitly adult rather than child-directed. The doll produced in her likeness was sold in tobacco shops and bars in Germany in the mid-1950s, not in toy stores, not marketed to children, but as a novelty item for adults who were fans of the strip and who appreciated the doll's specific aesthetic, which was the aesthetic of a woman whose primary characteristic was her physical attractiveness to men. Ruth Handler encountered the Build Lily doll on a trip to Europe in 1956. She brought several home. She presented them to the Mattel design team as a reference for what she wanted to create. The design that Mattel's engineers and designers produced for Barbie was closely derived from the Build Lily template. Close enough that Mattel eventually purchased the rights to Build Lily in 1964 and withdrew the German doll from the market in a transaction whose specific purpose was to resolve the intellectual property situation that the degree of similarity between the two dolls had created. The origin of Barbie, the doll that was presented to American parents as a toy for their daughters and that was marketed as an aspirational object for girls, was a German adult novelty item whose specific aesthetic was organized around female physical attractiveness as a male-directed appeal. The aspiration was real. The root of the aspiration was something more complicated. The doll that debuted at the Toy Fair on March 9, 1959, was 11.5 inches tall, had measurements that were subsequently calculated as equivalent to 3,918. 3 in human scale, had blonde hair in a ponytail, and was wearing a black and white swimsuit. She was given the name Barbie after Ruth Handler's daughter, Barbara. Her companion, Ken, named after Ruth's son, would not arrive until 1961. The initial response of the toy buyers at the Toy Fair was skeptical. Several major buyers declined to stock the doll on the grounds that American parents would not purchase a doll with breasts for their daughters. Ruth Handler's response to this assessment was to go directly to the children. Mattel advertised Barbie on the Mickey Mouse Club television program. The first time a toy company had marketed directly to children on television rather than through parents. The children responded, the parents purchased. Within a year, Barbie was a commercial phenomenon. The marketing that launched Barbie established the specific rhetorical framework that has governed the brand's public presentation for 65 years, and that is the framework within which the debate about her effects has always been conducted. She was presented as an aspirational object, as a doll that allowed girls to project themselves into adult roles and adult possibilities. The careers, the outfits, the accessories, the dream house, and the Corvette and the accessories of an adult life of capability and style. All of it was presented as the vehicle through which a girl playing with Barbie was doing something meaningful and developmental rather than merely entertaining herself. The aspiration was the brand, and the brand was successful enough and durable enough that the aspiration became the primary category through which the doll was assessed, both by its defenders, who pointed to the careers as evidence of its empowering function, and by its critics, who pointed to the body as evidence that the aspiration came with a cost that the brand was not acknowledging. The marketing that launched Barbie established the specific rhetorical framework that has governed the brand's public presentation for 65 years, and that is the framework within which the debate about her effects has always been conducted. She was presented as an aspirational object, as a doll that allowed girls to project themselves into adult roles and adult possibilities. The careers, the outfits, the accessories, the dream house, and the Corvette, and the accessories of an adult life of capability and style, all of it was presented as the vehicle through which a girl playing with Barbie was doing something meaningful and developmental rather than merely entertaining herself. The aspiration was the brand, and the brand was successful enough and durable enough that the aspiration became the primary category through which the doll was assessed, both by its defenders, who pointed to the careers as evidence of its empowering function, and by its critics, who pointed to the body as evidence that the aspiration came with a cost that the brand was not acknowledging. The commercial architecture that the Barbie brand built across the 1960s and 70s, was, in its specific structure, one of the most innovative business models in the history of consumer goods. The doll herself was sold at a price point that was accessible, deliberately so, because the real commercial engine was not the doll but the accessories, the dream house, the Corvette, the wardrobe, the horse, the camper van, the pool, the career outfits that needed to be purchased separately for each of the more than 200 professions that Barbie eventually occupied. The doll was the platform. The accessories were the monetization. The parent who purchased the doll for the child had purchased the entry point into a commercial ecosystem whose subsequent demands were structured around the specific developmental psychology of children who form. Attachments to play objects and who experience the acquisition of accessories for those objects as an extension of the relationship rather than a commercial transaction. Ruth Handler's Legal Difficulties, which are the chapter of the Mattel corporate history that the brand's official story manages most carefully, add a dimension to the founder narrative that the aspiration-centered account omits. In 1978, Handler pleaded no contest to federal charges of securities fraud and making false financial statements in connection with an investigation into Mattel's accounting practices during the early 1970s. The company had, under pressures that included a warehouse fire, a dock strike, and losses from a speculative television production venture, manipulated its financial reports to conceal the severity of its commercial difficulties from investors. Handler was fined and sentenced to community service. She subsequently founded a prosthetics company. She had herself undergone a mastectomy and had found the available prosthetics aesthetically inadequate, a fact that her defenders point to as evidence of the same practical empathy that had produced Barbie. She left Mattel. The company continued. The doll continued. The founder's departure from the company she had built was, like so much of the Barbie story, more complicated than the official version. The competitive landscape that Barbie has navigated across 65 years illuminates something important about the specific durability of the brand and the specific cultural function it serves. Numerous competitors have launched fashion dolls that were designed to challenge Barbie's market dominance. Dolls with more realistic body proportions, dolls with greater racial diversity, dolls whose career narratives were more substantively developed, dolls whose aesthetic was organized around different values than the ones that had made Barbie controversial. Most of these competitors have failed commercially in ways that their superior ethics relative to the Barbie standard have not been able to prevent. The most commercially significant challenge, the Bratz doll line, introduced by MGA Entertainment in 2001, was successful enough to genuinely threaten Barbie's market position and to eventually be the subject of a lengthy and expensive legal battle between Mattel and MGA over the circumstances of Bratz's creation. Bratz succeeded partly because it offered something Barbie was not offering in 2001, a more racially diverse lineup and an aesthetic that was, in its specific way, both more ethnically inclusive and arguably more problematic in its emphasis on a hypersexualized adult aesthetic directed at children. The competition between Barbie and Bratz was not a competition between empowerment and harm. It was a competition between two different configurations of the same fundamental tension. The debate about what Barbie actually did to the girls who play with her is one of the most extensively researched questions in the history of developmental psychology. And the research says something that neither the brand nor its harshest critics have been fully willing to say. Subscribe. The next section is where the evidence gets uncomfortable for everyone. The body proportions of the Barbie doll have been the subject of sustained academic and journalistic examination since at least the 1960s. And the specific numbers that have been calculated and recalculated by researchers in multiple countries over multiple decades are by any honest assessment extreme. The most frequently cited calculation conducted by researchers at the University of South Australia in the 1990s found that if Barbie's proportions were scaled to a woman of average American height, 5'4" inches, she would have a 39-inch bust, an 18-inch waist, and 33-inch hips. Her neck would be twice the length and half the circumference of the average American woman's neck, which researchers noted would make it anatomically incapable of supporting her head. Her waist would be too narrow to contain a full liver. She would have a body mass index of approximately 16.2, which the World Health Organization classifies as severely underweight and which is associated with significant health risks and with the kind of body composition that is produced by severe caloric restriction. Mattel has modified Barbie's proportions multiple times across her history, most significantly with the 2016 introduction of 3 new body types: curvy, tall, and petite, alongside the original proportions. The modification was presented as a response to consumer feedback and to the cultural conversation about body diversity that had been building across the preceding decade. It was also, by the assessments of people who followed the brand's commercial strategy, a response to declining sales and to the specific competitive pressure from other doll brands that had introduced more diverse body representation earlier. The curvy Barbie was, at the time of her introduction, both genuinely significant, the first time in 57 years that the brand had acknowledged that bodies other than the original proportion were worth representing, and considerably late, measured against the decades of research showing the original proportions effects on the girls who had played with it. The research on Barbie and body image is substantial, and it does not tell a simple story. The Oregon State study cited at the beginning of this documentary, showing reduced career aspirations after Barbie play, is one of the most frequently referenced, but it is not the only relevant study, and its conclusions are not the only conclusions the literature produces. A study published in Developmental Psychology in 2006 by researchers at the University of Sussex found that girls aged 5 to 8 who were exposed to Barbie images reported lower body esteem and greater desire for a thinner body than girls exposed to images of other doll types or no dolls at all. The effect was strongest in the youngest age group and diminished with age, which the researchers interpreted as suggesting that the influence of the doll was greatest precisely when children were forming the foundational beliefs about bodies and about what bodies should look like, that they would carry into adolescence and adulthood. A meta-analysis published in 2021, examining the accumulated research on fashion dolls and body image across multiple decades and multiple countries, found a consistent pattern. Exposure to thin fashion dolls was associated with increased body dissatisfaction in girls, with the effect being statistically significant across studies conducted in different cultural contexts and using different methodologies. The meta-analysis also found that the effect was moderated by parental conversation about bodies and about unrealistic body ideals. That girls whose parents talked explicitly about why the doll's proportions were unrealistic showed smaller effects than girls in households where the doll was given without context or commentary. This finding that the parental framing of the doll shapes its psychological impact is one of the most practically important conclusions in the entire body of research, and one that the popular conversation about Barbie has almost entirely ignored. The complication in the body image research is that isolating the effect of Barbie specifically from the broader environment of thin ideal messaging in which children grow up is methodologically very difficult. Girls in contemporary Western societies are exposed to idealized thin female bodies through television and film and advertising and social media and 100 other channels that operated before social media and that operate even more comprehensively now. The specific contribution of the Barbie doll to body dissatisfaction relative to all of these other sources of the same message is not something the research has been able to precisely quantify. What the research has established is that the doll contributes, that exposure to it is associated with measurable effects on body esteem and appearance-based self-evaluation. How large that contribution is relative to the broader thin ideal environment in which it exists is a question the literature has not been able to answer with the precision that public policy or parental decision-making would require. The eating disorder dimension of the body image question is the dimension where the advocacy community has been most vocal and where the research is most difficult to interpret. The claim that Barbie causes eating disorders is not supported by the evidence in the direct causal form that the claim usually takes. Eating disorders are complex conditions with multiple contributing factors. Genetic vulnerability, family environment, trauma, peer relationships, cultural exposure, and attributing them to any single cause is not something the research supports. What the research does support is the more modest claim that early exposure to unrealistic body ideals, of which Barbie is one prominent source, is a contributing factor to the body dissatisfaction that is itself a significant risk factor for disordered eating. The doll is not the cause, it is part of an environment that produces the condition in which other causes can operate more effectively. The distinction matters because overstating the claim undermines the legitimate concern and provides easy targets for the brand's defenders. What I want to show you now is the dimension of this debate that the body image research and the career aspiration research have both, in their different ways, been circling without quite addressing directly. It is the question of what Barbie actually communicated to the girls who played with her, not the message that Mattel intended, and not the message that the critics identified, but the message that the children themselves received, and that the developmental research, when it examines what children actually understood from the play rather than what the adults around them intended them to understand, produces findings about that should change how this debate is conducted. Stay with me, because the message the children received is not the message anyone was sending. And that gap between the intended message and the received message is where the most important part of this story lives. The career timeline of the Barbie doll is worth examining with the specific attention to cultural timing that makes it most illuminating. Barbie became an astronaut in 1965, 4 years before Neil Armstrong walked on the moon, and at a time when no American woman had been to space and when NASA was not actively recruiting women for the astronaut program. She became a surgeon in 1973, the same year the Supreme Court decided Roe v. Wade, and when women represented approximately 9% of medical school graduates. She ran for president in 1992, 2 years before the first woman ran for vice president on a major party ticket, and 24 years before Hillary Clinton became the first woman to win a major party presidential nomination. The sequence is not accidental. Mattel's career choices were, across the history of the brand, consistently ahead of the actual representation of women in those fields, sometimes by years, sometimes by decades. The doll was doing something real. It was representing possibilities. Before the possibilities were normalized in the world, the children playing with it were going to inhabit. The complication in the career aspiration story is not that the careers were not real or that the aspiration they represented was false. The complication is the specific way that the career aspiration was packaged. Barbie was not simply an astronaut or a surgeon or a presidential candidate. She was a glamorous astronaut, a surgically precise surgeon with immaculate makeup, a presidential candidate in a fitted pink suit. The career aspiration was inseparable from the specific aesthetic through which it was delivered, an aesthetic that communicated simultaneously with the message about professional possibility a message about what professional women should look like and how their appearance should be managed. The two messages were delivered together in the same package through the same play object. And the research on how children process multiple simultaneous messages from play objects suggests that the body message and the career message were not received as separate communications that children could independently evaluate. They were received as a single integrated statement. You can be anything, and here is what anything looks like. The developmental psychologist Sandra Bem, whose work on gender schema theory is among the most influential in the field, argued that children develop gender schemas, cognitive frameworks for organizing information about what is appropriate and possible for people of their gender from an early age, and through precisely the kind of object-mediated experience that play with gender-specific toys represents. The Barbie doll, in Bem's framework, is not simply a toy. It is a gender schema delivery mechanism, an object that communicates to the children who play with it a set of propositions about what female identity looks like, what female aspirations are appropriate, and what female bodies should look like in a form that is processed not as explicit instruction, but as environmental reality. Children do not evaluate gender schemas the way adults evaluate explicit arguments. They absorb them, and the gender schema that Barbie delivers includes both the career possibilities and the body standard, both the aspiration and the aesthetic as components of a single integrated picture of what female identity means. Christie, the first black friend doll in the Barbie line, was introduced in 1968, 9 years after Barbie's debut. The specific timeline, 9 years during which the aspirational object that was being marketed to all American girls represented only one of the racial identities of those girls, is a timeline that the brand's official history tends to present as a progressive evolution, and that a more honest examination presents as a 9-year failure to recognize that the empowerment message was being sent. Selectively, a message of aspiration delivered through a white doll to a black child carries a specific implication that the brand did not intend, and that the brand's subsequent history suggests it took decades to fully reckon with. The introduction of Christie was accompanied by marketing and by the kind of institutional celebration that brands deploy when they make decisions they regard as progressive. What was less celebrated, and what the subsequent history of the black dolls in the Barbie line reveals, is that the integration of the line was more complicated than the introduction of a single friend doll suggested. For years following Christie's introduction, the black dolls in the line were produced with the same mold as the white Barbie, the same face, the same features, the same specific physiognomy of the original Barbie, covered in a darker plastic. The message of representation was being delivered through a form that was not representing the thing it claimed to represent. It was representing Barbie with different coloring, which is not the same thing as representing the specific physical identity of the girls the doll was supposed to be speaking to. Truly ethnic Barbie, the doll with distinctly African-American facial features, rather than the standard Barbie mold covered in darker plastic, was not introduced until 1980. That is 21 years after the original Barbie's introduction, during which the aspirational object that was being marketed to black girls as a representation of what they could become was, in its specific physical construction, a representation of what they were not. The developmental research on racial representation in toys suggests that this matters, that children develop their sense of what is normative and what is possible, partly through the physical characteristics of the objects they're given to play with, and that the consistent presentation of a white face as the default face of aspiration and achievement carries implications for the racial self-concept of the children who receive it that are not resolved by telling. Them, the darker colored version of the same face is meant to represent them The Latinx representation in the Barbie line followed a similarly complicated trajectory. Teresa, Barbie's Latina friend, was introduced in 1988, 29 years after the original Barbie. Asian representation in the line has been even more inconsistently handled. A series of dolls with Asian-inspired names and aesthetics that have, at various points across the brand's history, deployed the specific form of cultural representation that uses the surface markers of a cultural identity without the substantive engagement with what that identity means. The broader pattern across the racial history of the Barbie line is a pattern of progressive expansion conducted at a pace that consistently lagged behind the demographic reality of the market the brand was serving, and the cultural reality of the society in which the brand operated. The 2016 introduction of the 3 new body types was accompanied by expanded racial and skin tone diversity. 7 skin tones, 22 eye colors, 23 hairstyles were among the specifications that Mattel's press materials highlighted. The expansion was, by the assessments of the advocacy organizations and the academics who had spent decades arguing for it, genuine and significant. It was also, in the specific language of the brand's marketing, presented as a listening exercise, as evidence that Mattel had heard the criticism and responded. The framing of the expansion as responsive corporate behavior, rather than as a correction of a design philosophy that had been documented as psychologically harmful for decades, was a framing that allowed the brand to present the change as generosity rather than as acknowledgement of prior harm. The distinction between those two framings is not simply rhetorical. It is the distinction between a brand that understands what it did and a brand that is managing what it did. Here is what the debate everyone missed actually looks like when you assemble the evidence honestly. It is not the debate between the brand's defenders and the brand's critics. It is the debate between two things that are simultaneously true and that the popular conversation about Barbie has consistently treated as if they cannot be simultaneously true. The doll gave girls permission to imagine themselves in professional roles in a cultural moment when that permission was not widely available elsewhere. And the doll delivered that permission through a body that communicated with the specific legibility that visual objects communicate to developing children. That the female body is primarily a site of aesthetic performance rather than human capability. Both of those things happened. Both of those things are real. And the question that the debate has missed is not which one is true. The question is what we do with the fact that the empowerment and the damage were delivered simultaneously in the same object by the same act of play. That is the question. And it does not have an easy answer. The Barbie film, released by Warner Bros. In July 2003, directed by Greta Gerwig and starring Margot Robbie as the title character and Ryan Gosling as Ken, grossed $1.44 billion at the global box office, making it the highest grossing film of that year and the highest grossing film ever directed by a woman. The commercial achievement was extraordinary. The cultural conversation it generated was, in its specific dimensions and its specific intensity, something that a film about a plastic doll should not, by normal logic, have been capable of generating. It generated it because the film was not, despite its surface presentation, a film about a plastic doll. It was a film about the debate that this documentary is examining about the specific contradiction at the heart of the Barbie brand, about the gap between the empowerment message and the physical package it was delivered in, about what it means to be a woman who has been told she can be anything and who discovers that the world she has been prepared for is not the world that exists. Greta Gerwig's approach to the material to make a film that was simultaneously a celebration of the doll and an examination of the doll's specific ideology was a creative decision of considerable intelligence and considerable commercial risk. The risk was that a film that interrogated Barbie's contradictions might alienate the audience that the brand's existing relationship with the doll had produced. And that a film that celebrated the brand uncritically would not generate the cultural conversation that could elevate it above the level of an expensive toy commercial. What she produced threaded the needle in a way that the grosses demonstrate worked commercially, and that the cultural conversation demonstrates worked critically. A film that gave you the pleasure of the brand while simultaneously showing you the architecture of the contradiction and inviting you to feel both things at the same time. The specific scene in the film that generated the most sustained discussion, the speech delivered by America Ferrera's character Gloria, in which she articulates the specific impossible double standard that women face in contemporary society, was not a scene about Barbie specifically. It was a scene about the condition that Barbie both reflected and contributed to. The condition of being a woman in a world that tells you to be confident and not arrogant, to be ambitious and not threatening, to be attractive and not vain, to have opinions and not be aggressive, to be present and not take up too much space. The speech went viral in the specific way that articulations of shared experience go viral when the articulation reaches something that a significant number of people have felt but not found the language for. It was shared widely by women who identified with it and discussed extensively by commentators across the political spectrum who had varying views about whether its diagnosis of the female condition was accurate, and whether a major studio blockbuster was the appropriate vehicle for its delivery. The marketing campaign for the film, one of the most elaborate and most expensive marketing campaigns in recent cinema history, conducted across months of coordinated releases and collaborations and cultural events that built anticipation in a way that the industry described as unprecedented, was itself a demonstration of the specific genius that the Barbie brand has always deployed in its most effective iterations. The ability to be everywhere, to feel simultaneously personal and universal. To make the encounter with the brand feel like an encounter with something that is about you specifically, rather than about a commercial product that has been placed in your environment by a corporation. The pink that saturated the marketing campaign, the pink that became, in the summer of 2023, a visual language for a conversation about feminism and nostalgia and corporate culture and the specific complications of growing up female in a world organized around objects like Barbie, was deployed with the specific understanding that the color had been so thoroughly identified with the brand across 65 years that invoking it was invoking everything the brand had accumulated. The good and the bad, and the complicated and the pleasurable and the problematic, all at once. The academic response to the film was predictably more complicated than the popular response. Researchers who had spent careers examining the brand's effects on girls and women found themselves in the specific position of needing to assess a film that acknowledged the criticism they had been making while being produced by the corporation that owned the brand they had been criticizing, funded by the commercial success that the brand they had been criticizing had generated, and distributed by a major studio whose commercial interests were served by the cultural conversation the film generated. The film's self-awareness about the Barbie contradiction was, from this perspective, simultaneously genuine and managed, a piece of genuine cultural intelligence deployed in the service of commercial objectives that the self-awareness was designed to make more palatable. The specific irony that the film's most commercially successful element, the Ken storyline, in which Ryan Gosling's performance generated a cultural moment and a level of audience affection that in some discussions exceeded the response to the title character was organized around an examination of patriarchy is an irony that the cultural critics who examined the film most carefully noted with varying degrees of generosity. The film made significant money partly because of a performance that interrogated the ideology the brand had reinforced for decades. The interrogation was genuine, the money was real. The relationship between the two, between the genuine cultural critique and the commercial benefit that accrued to the corporation whose product was being critiqued, is the kind of relationship that the entertainment industry's capacity to absorb criticism and convert it into content makes possible. And that is not reducible to simple cynicism without losing something true. The developmental psychology research on Barbie has, across 65 years of accumulation, reached a set of conclusions that are more nuanced and more honest than the popular debate has been able to absorb. The doll is not uniquely responsible for the body dissatisfaction that affects a significant proportion of girls and women in contemporary Western societies. It is a contributing factor in a broader environment of thin ideal messaging whose other contributors, fashion magazines, advertising, film, television, and now social media in its various forms, operate at scales and frequencies that dwarf the individual contribution of any single toy. The claim that getting rid of Barbie would meaningfully reduce body dissatisfaction in girls is not supported by the research, because the research shows that the environment producing body dissatisfaction is not dependent on any single source. The doll is also not, as its defenders have sometimes argued, a neutral vehicle for aspirational play whose effects are entirely determined by the narratives that children impose on it. The body is not neutral. The face is not neutral. The specific aesthetic that the doll embodies, the specific visual language of femininity that it deploys, communicates something to the children who play with it that is prior to and independent of the specific narrative that the child constructs around the play. The message that the body sends is not cancelled by the career outfit. The career outfit says you can be a doctor. The body says a doctor looks like this. And the research suggests that children, particularly young children, are reading both messages simultaneously and integrating them into the beliefs about bodies and about what bodies are for, that they are constructing in exactly the years that the doll is most intensively used. The question of what parents should do with this information is a question that the research has also addressed, with findings that are more practically useful than the popular debate about the doll suggests. The single most protective factor identified in the research is parental conversation. The explicit discussion of why the doll's proportions are unrealistic, why no human being is shaped like Barbie, why the doll's body is a product of design decisions made by adults in the 1950s rather than a representation of what female bodies look like or should look like. Children who receive this conversation show significantly smaller negative effects from Barbie exposure. The conversation is not complicated. It does not require the parent to be an academic or a feminist theorist. It requires the parent to say, when the doll is given and played with, something like, "This doll has a body that real people don't have, and here is why that matters." That sentence, or some version of it, is among the most protective interventions the research has identified, and it costs nothing. The question of what Mattel should do, what the brand owes the generations of girls it has shaped, and the generation it is currently shaping, is a question that the 2016 diversification, the 2023 film, have partially addressed, and that the full record of the brand's history suggests has not yet been fully answered. The expanded body types and the racial diversity that the current Barbie line represents are genuine improvements over the line that existed from 1959 to 2016. They are also improvements that were made under commercial pressure rather than in advance of it, that arrived after decades of documented harm rather than before it. and that have been packaged in the specific language of corporate responsiveness that makes the brand a better cultural actor without fully acknowledging what the previous iterations of the brand were. The acknowledgement matters, not as a legal matter. Mattel is not legally liable for the body dissatisfaction of generations of American girls. As a cultural matter, as the difference between a brand that has genuinely reckoned with its history and a brand that has incorporated its critics' language into its marketing without fully inhabiting what that language requires. The question of what parents should do with this information is a question that the research has also addressed, with findings that are more practically useful than the popular debate about the doll suggests. The single most protective factor identified in the research is parental conversation. The explicit discussion of why the doll's proportions are unrealistic, why no human being is shaped like Barbie, why the doll's body is a product of design decisions made by adults in the 1950s rather than a representation of what female bodies look like or should look like. Children who receive this conversation show significantly smaller negative effects from Barbie exposure. The conversation is not complicated. It does not require the parent to be an academic or a feminist theorist. It requires the parent to say, when the doll is given and played with, something like, "This doll has a body that real people don't have, and here is why that matters." That sentence, or some version of it, is among the most protective interventions the researchers identified. And it costs nothing. The dimension of the Barbie debate that the academic literature has examined and that the popular conversation has almost entirely avoided is the question of what boys who play with or are exposed to Barbie absorb from the experience. Boys play with Barbie. They always have, to a lesser degree than girls, in patterns shaped by the same gender socialization processes that shape all childhood play. But in numbers that the research on toy preferences across genders documents as real and consistent. What the boys absorb from the exposure is not identical to what the girls absorb, but it is not neutral. The research on boys and fashion dolls suggests that boys who are exposed to Barbie develop, through the exposure, not body dissatisfaction about their own bodies, but a set of beliefs about female bodies, about what female bodies look like and what female bodies are for, that are shaped by the specific aesthetic that the doll embodies. The doll does not only tell girls what they should look like, it tells boys what girls should look like. And the boys are listening. The social media amplification of the thin ideal environment in which Barbie operates has, in the decades since platforms like Instagram and TikTok achieved mass penetration, created a context for the doll's effects that is different from the context in which the foundational research was conducted. Girls growing up now are encountering Barbie in an environment in which the thin ideal the doll represents is reinforced not only by other toys and by traditional media, but by algorithmically curated feeds of images. That the platform's engagement optimization systems have determined are most effective at producing the compulsive return behavior that generates advertising revenue. The research showing that algorithmic social media exposure is associated with body dissatisfaction in adolescent girls is extensive and has been produced by platform's own internal research as well as by independent academic study. The specific contribution of Barbie to body dissatisfaction in this environment is even harder to isolate than it was in the pre-social media environment, because the environment is so saturated with the same message from so many sources that the individual contribution of any single source is difficult to disentangle. What can be said is that the doll and the algorithm are sending the same message through different channels, and that the cumulative effect of receiving the same message from multiple channels simultaneously is not simply additive, but multiplicative. The 22-3 Barbie film's treatment of the social media dimension was one of its notable omissions. The film was set in a world in which Barbie world and the real world existed in a specific relationship. But the real world of the film was not a world in which algorithmic body image optimization was a named feature of the landscape. This is understandable from a narrative standpoint. Making a film that examined the intersection of Barbie and algorithmic body image amplification would have required a level of engagement with the current media environment that would have complicated the film's tonal balance. It is also, from the perspective of the full honest examination of what the brand does in the world it actually inhabits, an absence that the critical conversation about the film has not adequately noted. Ruth Handler died on April 27, 2002, at the age of 85. She had, across the decades since the doll's creation, been both the champion of the aspiration it represented and the subject of the criticism it generated, and she had responded to the criticism with a specific combination of genuine belief in what she had built and genuine defensiveness about the implications that the research was drawing from it. She believed to the end that the doll had done more good than harm. The research does not fully support that belief and does not fully contradict it. What it suggests is that the doll did good and harm simultaneously in ways that were not fully separable through the same acts of play to the same children across the same decades. That is not the answer that either side of the debate has been comfortable with. It is the honest one. Did Barbie empower girls or damage them? Both. The careers gave permission that the culture was not giving elsewhere. The body delivered a standard that the culture was already giving everywhere, and that the doll reinforced rather than challenged. The racial exclusion communicated for decades, whose aspiration the brand considered worth representing. The 2016 diversification acknowledged, without quite admitting, that the exclusion had been wrong. The 2023 film made $1.44 billion by examining the contradiction in a way that the corporation that owned the brand approved and funded and distributed. The contradiction is still there, the research is still accumulating, the girls are still playing, and the conversation that the evidence requires, specific, honest, conducted with the care that the developmental stakes demand, is still not the conversation that the popular debate about Barbie is having. The doll is 11.5 inches tall and has been in continuous production for 65 years. She has been a surgeon and an astronaut and a presidential candidate and an architect and a scientist and a pilot and a chef and a marine biologist and more than 190 other things that real women are, and that women in the decades when those career outfits were produced were told they could not be. She has also been, for 65 years, a body that no real woman has, and that the research suggests real women are worse for having internalized as a standard. She is both of those things at once. She has always been both of those things at once. The debate is not about which one is true. The debate is about what we do with both of them being true, and that debate, the honest one, the difficult one, the one that does not resolve into a verdict but into a responsibility, is the debate that everyone missed. Thank you for staying until the end. This is the celebrity code, and the code, once you see it, cannot be unseen.